Okay, so topic 17, the quadratic formula. We're going to go over how to use the quadratic formula and how to use the discriminants and roots that we get from the quadratic formula. Okay. So we use quadratic formula when we're talking about a quadratic function. So remember, the standard form for a quadratic function is that ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Whenever we see our quadratic in that standard form, we can identify our a, b, and c, and then plug that into the quadratic formula. So again, we saw a little of that on Monday. So the quadratic formula is x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. On these notes, some of our problems, once we use the quadratic formula, is going to give us imaginary numbers. So we get an imaginary number when we take the square root of a negative number. So for example, if we took the square root of negative 4, we would say that the square root of just the 4 is 2, but since we have a negative there, we're going to have to write an I next to it, and that I stands for imaginary. What this means is that if I had a graph of a quadratic function, my quadratic function would not pass through the x-axis. Okay? So remember, this is x, this is y. Since it didn't pass through the x-axis here, that means there are no real roots, meaning there's no real numbers that we could establish as the x-intercepts. Okay? However, we can say that these roots still pass through some type of number, but on an imaginary surface. Okay? So we're not going to go further into imaginary numbers than just knowing that if you have the square root of a negative number and it's a perfect square root, you can just write whatever that square root is and then an I next to it. Okay. You'll see that in some of the examples coming up. Okay. So looking at number 1, the first thing we're going to check is to see if our function is in standard form. So yes or no, is it in standard form? Yes, because we have x squared first, we have our x in the middle, and then we have our constant at the end. So we're going to label our a, b, and c. So our a is going to be 1, since we don't see a number in front of x squared. Our b is going to be that negative 4, and our c is that negative 3. Okay. So writing the quadratic formula, I'm just going to write it out real quick. I'm going to plug in all of my a, b, and c in order to solve for x. And when I solve for x, what I'm finding are the x-intercepts, the roots. Okay, so plugging in all my numbers, I have x is equal to negative b. Well, our b is already negative, so what am I going to write? Positive 4 plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 4 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is negative 3, all over 2 times a, which is 2 times 1. Okay. Once we have everything plugged in, the easiest way to put this in your calculator is to put just whatever is under the parentheses first. So I would plug in that negative 4 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 3. Just don't forget about the parentheses. When you do that, you get x is equal to 4 plus or minus the square root of 28. So you should have got 28 under that square root, all divided by 2. Okay. So that means we have two possible answers here. We have when x is equal to 4 plus the square root of 28 divided by 2, and x is equal to 4 minus the square root of 28 divided by 2. So you would type that each into your calculator separately, and you're going to get a decimal. If you ever get a decimal, just make sure you round to just the 2 decimal places. Yes?
So what is the process once you put the numbers in the calculators? Like what would you do first? Negative 4 squared and then 4 times 1 that answer times -3?
So in the calculator all at once, I would type in parentheses -4 parentheses squared. So that first part. Don't click enter or solve yet. Then hit minus and then put this whole last part in an extra set of parentheses because that whole part is being subtracted from that -4 squared. So on your calculator, you should just type, oops, let me write it in. So -4 squared, including all the parentheses that I'm writing. Okay, that's what you should be typing in. Okay. These extra parentheses that I'm putting around the last part is telling your calculator that this entire thing is being subtracted from that -4 squared. So when you do it now, do you get 28? Yes. Okay. Any other questions? I mean, another way you could do it is you could just do this part, -4 squared, and you get 16. And then you could do this part, and -4 times 1 times -3 is a positive 12. 16 plus 12 is 28. So you could break it down as much as you like. So when you plug these 2 answer choices into your calculator, you should have got x is equal to 7.29 and x is equal to -3.29. Again, when you plug this into your calculator, make sure this first part is in parentheses. So it would be parentheses 4 plus the square root of 28, close parentheses, divided by 2. Okay, make sure this first part's in parentheses. Okay. And if you ever end up with an answer that includes the decimal, we're only rounding to 2 decimal places. Okay. So those are our 2 possible x-intercepts. Any questions so far? For the first one?
Yeah.
Let me see. Did everyone get different answers?
I got 4.65.
Okay. Then that was probably me, calculator. And then negative 0.65?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so that was my bad. What was the first one you said?
4.65.
Four-
Like 4.64 or something.
Oh, okay.
Rounded up.
Yeah. Okay, correction. You should have got those 2 answers here. So just shows how important it is when you're plugging into your calculator that you plug in this part in parentheses. So looking at number 2, the first thing we check to see is if it's in standard form. So is this one in standard form? No. How can we get it in standard form? Good. Subtract 9. So I'm going to subtract 9 from both sides, and I get x squared plus 3 is equal to 0. Okay. This tells us what value is missing. The b value. So I have my a value, which is 1. B is missing, so that means b is 0. And then my c value is that 3. So if we have any of our values missing, then that value is going to be 0 when we plug it into our formula. So again, writing the quadratic formula. Then we can start plugging everything in. So we have x is equal to negative b. So what would I write there? 0, right? Because we can't have a negative 0. I would just write 0. Plus or minus the square root of 0 squared minus 4 times, what's a? 1 times c, 3, all over 2 times a, 2 times 1. Okay. So since we have that 0 squared here, you could just type this part into your calculator. Negative 4 times 1 times 13, and that gives us what? Negative 12. So we have x is equal to plus or minus, because I don't need to write that 0 in the front anymore, the square root of negative 12 all divided by 2. Okay. Since we have the square root of a negative number, that tells us that our roots are going to be what? Imaginary. So we're going to have an I in our answer. Okay. So that means the two answers we have is x is equal to the square root of negative 12 over 2, and x is equal to negative square root of negative 12 over 2. So one of our answers are going to be positive, the other is going to be negative. Okay. So go ahead and try to plug that into your calculator. You should have got x is equal to 1.73i. When you plug into your calculator, don't plug in square root of negative 12 because it's going to give you an error. Okay? Just plug in square root of 12 divided by 2. And then on the next one, negative square root of 12 divided by 2. We already know that the I is going to be included in our answer. However, if you are using, just the standard scientific calculator, it's going to just pop up as an error.
Say it again.
So when you type this into the calculator, don't type in the negative under that square root because it's going to give you an error. So just type in the square root of 12 divided by 2. And when you do that, you should get 1.73. Correct? Everyone got it? And then we just write an I next to that answer because we know when we take the square root of a negative number, that's going to turn it imaginary. So the only part you need to remember here is that if you have a square root of a negative number, forget about the negative for now, type it in your calculator, and at the end when you write your answer, make sure you include an I, and that I stands for imaginary. Okay, any questions on 2? Okay, looking at number 3, is this in standard form? No. What do we need to do to make it standard form? Good, so we could subtract x squared over, so it's equal to 0. But I want to leave my x squared positive, so what can I do instead? Good. Add the 5x and subtract the 2. So that means I have x squared plus 5x minus 2 equals 0. So I just took these terms over here and moved them to the left. Okay. Now that it's in standard form, what is going to be my a, b, and c value? A is going to be 1, b is, and c is 2 or negative 2? Negative 2. Make sure we include the sign in front. Okay. Again, I'm rewriting my formula. So I can start plugging everything in. So I have x is equal to negative b. What am I going to place there? Minus 5, good. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 5 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1 times c, which is negative 2, all over 2 times 1, 2 times a. So again, you can type that whole discriminant that's under the radical sign into your calculator, or you can just do 5 squared, which we know is 25, and negative 4 times 1 times negative 2 is positive 8. So that means under the radical, you should have 25 plus 8, which is 33. So x is equal to negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 33 over 2. Once I have it this simplified, I now can split this into 2 answers. My first answer is going to be x is equal to negative 5 plus the square root of 33 divided by 2. And x is equal to negative 5 minus the square root of 33 divided by 2. Remember, when you type this in your calculator, make sure you put parentheses around that top part before you divide by 2. Okay, and then you should have got x is equal to 0.37 and x is equal to negative 5.37. Go ahead and double check, make sure everyone got the same. Yes. Oh, it keeps it as a fraction? That's fine.
Like it just switches around, like it ends with negative 5 minus 33.2 and just puts the negative 5 after.
Oh, I see. Make sure in your settings that the calculator is set to, I believe it should be set to DEC, decimal. See if that helps. Okay. Number 4, is this in standard form? Yep, so that means we can already label our A, B, and C. So what's going to be A? Good. B? Good. Negative 3. Always include that sign. And then C? Good. So plugging everything into our formula. Okay. Instead of writing the formula this time, I'm just going to start plugging everything in. So I know I have x is equal to negative b. So what would I write for negative b? Just a positive 3, right? Because our b is already negative. So minus a negative, same as plus a positive. So 3 plus or minus the square root of b squared. So negative 3 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, and c, all divided by 2 times a, which is 2 times 1, so we get 2. Okay, so when you plug in this part under the radical, you should have got negative 15. Does that sound right? Okay. So that means we have x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 15 all divided by 2. Okay. Since we have a negative under the square root, that tells us that our roots are imaginary. So when you type this into your calculator, do not include the negative. Just make sure your answer includes an I. So we would have two possible answers. X is equal to 3 plus the square root of negative 15 over 2. And x is equal to 3 minus the square root of negative 15 over 2. So when you're plugging into your calculator, you're ignoring the negative and then adding an I to your answer. So you should have got x is equal to 3.44i and x is equal to negative 0.44i. Does that sound correct? Okay. Okay. Now let's look at number 5. So our first thing we check is what? Standard form. Is this one in standard form? No, so what should we move over? The right to the left or the left to the right? Right to left. So we're going to move these ones over to the left. And we do that by subtracting the 8 and adding the 2x, whatever is opposite. So I have x squared plus 4x plus 17 minus 8 plus 2x equals 0. Okay. Before I continue, I'm going to have to combine like terms. So I have 4x and 2x, and then 17 and minus 8. So combining those like terms, I get x squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 0. Now I can label my A, B, and C value and start plugging it into the quadratic formula. So that means I have x is equal to negative b. So in this case, negative b is going to be what? Negative 6 plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 6 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 9, all divided by 2 times a, which is going to be 2. So when you type this into your calculator here, just whatever's under that radical, what are you going to get? 0. So if I take the square root of 0, what is that going to give us? 0. So I have x is equal to negative 6 plus or minus 0 over 2. Do I need that plus or minus 0? I don't. So I could write this as x is equal to negative 6 divided by 2. Negative 6 divided by 2 is what? Negative 3. We only got one answer here, so what does that tell you? How many x-intercepts are there going to be? 1. So in this case, we have 1 x-intercept instead of 2. So a graph of that would look something like this, where it only touches the x-axis one time. So we would have 1 root. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. 1 second, it's my son's school. Okay. So now looking at number 6. Number 6, right off the bat, is this in standard form? Yes, it is in standard form. Do we want to work with the fractions? No, so let's get rid of the fractions. How do we get rid of them? You remember? Yep, multiply everything by what? The common denominator. And what's the common denominator here? 4. So I'm going to multiply everything by 4. So 4 times x squared gives me 4x squared. You could do this one or two ways. You could type in your calculator -3/2 times 4. Or you could do -3 times 4, which is 12. 12 divided by 2 is 6. So we're going to have a -6x. So you could choose to do that in your head or type that into your calculator. Same with the next part, 1/4 times 4. If you type that in your calculator, you're going to get 1. Or you could do 1 times 4 divided by 4, which is 1. So -1 equals 0. Okay. So what's different about this problem versus the rest of them? Good. Our A is now going to be a 4 and not a 1. Okay. So plugging everything into our formula, we have x is equal to -b. So what would I write for -b? 6. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, so -6 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 4 times c, -1 all over 2a. So in this time, instead of writing 2, I do 2 times 4, which is 8, because 2a, 2 times the a value. Okay. Now I'm going to simplify the part under the radical here. Okay. You're going to get a positive number, and that number should be 52. Okay. Should have got 52. So now that we have this part, we can separate this into our two possible answers. So x is equal to 6 plus the square root of 52 over 8. And x is equal to 6 minus the square root of 52 over 8. Okay. So that means we're going to get two decimal answers here. The first one, you should have got x is equal to 2.55 and x is equal to -1.05. Is that the same as everyone else?
I got 1.65.
Let me check. Again, it could just be an error on my part with the calculator. You have 1.65 for the first one.
And the second one I got minus 0.15.
Okay, so let me double check that one. So negative 0.15?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. We're going to go ahead and do we're going to skip down to number 9 because I want to leave time to go over some questions on the test. So we're skipping down to number 9. So looking at number 9, is this in standard form?
Yes.
Yes, it is in standard form. What value are we missing? B. So we're going to write B as 0. So our A value is that 0.16. B is 0. And our C value is 1. So plugging this in, we have X is equal to negative B. So what would I write? 0 plus or minus the square root of B squared. So 0 squared minus 4 times A, which is that 0.16, times C, which is 1. All divided by 2 times A. So 2 times 0.16 is 0.32. Okay. Right away, what do you notice about this part under the radical? Is it going to be positive or negative? It's going to be negative. So when you plug that in, you should get X is equal to plus or minus, because we don't need that 0 there anymore, the square root of negative 0.64, all divided by 0.32. Okay. So that means we have 2 possible answers. We have X is equal to positive square root of negative 0.64 divided by 0.32, and then the negative version. Remember, when you're typing this into your calculator, ignore the negative under the radical sign, and then just include an I in your answer. So the first one, you should have got 2.5i and negative 2.5i. Because in your calculator, when you take the square root of 0.64, you should get 0.8. And then 0.8 divided by 0.32 gives you that 2.5. Any questions on using the quadratic formula? So again, we use the quadratic formula to find what? Our x-intercepts. So if you have a problem where it says find the x-intercepts, or find the roots, or find the zeros, those are all the same thing. So x-intercepts is the same thing as roots, which is the same thing as zeros. All those words mean the same thing. If you're asked to find any of those, always use the quadratic formula. The last part of these notes are going over the discriminant. Okay. The discriminant can be used to determine how many solutions a quadratic equation will have. The discriminant is the term under the square root. So again, this can determine how many solutions, and it's the part under the square root. Okay. The part under the square root is that b squared minus 4ac. If we use this formula, that b squared minus 4ac, it can tell us whether or not we have 2 real solutions, 2 imaginary solutions, or 1 real solution. So this, very important, star, star, hint, hint. That's important. So if our discriminant is positive, that means we're going to have 2 real solutions. If our discriminant is negative, so we have a negative square root, we're going to have 2 imaginary solutions or no real solution. So it just depends on what the problem wants us to do. If the discriminant is 0, we're going to have 1 real solution. Okay. Let's go ahead and look at number 13. Our first step, just like before, is to make sure that this is in standard form. Is this in standard form? Yes. So that means we can label our A, B, and C. So this is A, B, and C. So A and B are -4, and C is 5. So we're only using the discriminant formula, which is b squared minus 4ac. So plugging that in, we have b squared, so -4 squared, minus 4 times a, which is -4, times c, which is 5. Okay. Again, you can type this entire thing into your calculator. Just make sure you have an extra set of parentheses around the last part. Or you can type it in separately. So we know that -4 squared is 16. And -4 times -4 times 5 is 80. So we have 16 plus 80, which gives us 96. Okay, so looking back up at this chart, which one describes our 96? The first one, because it says the discriminant is positive. So since we have a positive number, this tells me we're going to have how many solutions? 2 real solutions. So on these type of questions, I'm looking for you to write 2 real solutions. So I need to see that you found the discriminant, which in this case was 96. And since it's positive, that tells us we're going to have 2 real solutions, or 2 real x-intercepts. Okay, let's look at number 15 right below it. Right off the bat, we're checking what? Is it in standard form? So yes or no? No. What do we need to do to make it standard form? Good. Move the 10 over. When we do that, we have 9x squared minus 3x, and -8 plus 10 gives us plus 2 equals 0. Okay? So that means we have our A, B, and C values. So go ahead and plug that into that b squared minus 4ac and tell me if you get something that's positive, negative, or 0. So when we plug everything in, we get negative 3 squared minus 4 times 9 times 2. Negative 3 squared is 9. Negative 4 times 9 times 2 is a negative 72. So we don't even have to finish this because we know 9 minus 72 is going to give us a negative number. And that negative number is negative 63. So that tells us what about our solutions? Good, it has 2 imaginary solutions. Or if you wrote no real solutions, that's also a correct answer because that is 2 ways of saying the same thing. So again, back at the chart at the top, you can say 2 imaginary solutions, or you can say no real solutions. They mean the same thing. Okay, let's look at number 18. Number 18, is this in standard form? No, what do we need to do to make it standard form?
Everything from the right to the left.
Good, we need to move all this over to the left. So we do that by subtracting the 8x and adding the 4. So we get 4x squared minus 8x plus 4 equals 0, because there was no like terms for any of those to combine with. So we label our A, B, and C. Go ahead and plug it into the formula and tell me if you get negative, positive, or 0. Good, you should get 0, because if we plug it into b squared, so negative 8 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 4, times c, which is again 4, and then we simplify. Negative 8 squared is 64. Negative 4 times 4 times 4 is negative 64. Subtract those, and we get 0. And that 0 tells us what? 1 real solution. Okay. Let's see. Let's look at the last one here, number 22. Okay, on number 22, is this in standard form? No, what do we have to do to make it standard form? Good, subtract that 5x squared. Move it over to the left. So that means we have 8x squared minus 5x squared, which gives us 3x squared, and I'm bringing everything else down. So that means if I label this, I have my a as 3, b is negative 6, and c as 3. Okay, go ahead and plug this into the formula. Tell me if you get positive, negative, or 0.
0.
Correct, you should get 0. So b squared is negative 6 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 3, times c, which is 3. Negative 6 squared is 36, and negative 4 times 3 is negative 36, which gives us 0. And since we have 0, that tells us what about our solutions? 1 real solution.